Hi, we're going to continue doing these Bible studies this way while we're all secluded, but I'm gonna do them a little differently now. I'm actually going to break them into smaller sections, so those of you who like to watch them all back to back, you're going to have a long time watching that. But for people who just want to get a quick point from the scripture, what we're talking about, you'll have a much smaller section so that you can just kind of digest each little bit as we go. But we're going to be in the book of John, chapter 18, for these next several Bible studies, because we're really going to start talking about what's going on with Jesus and Pilate for several of them, because Jesus and Pilate have a very interesting conversation that they have, and even leading up to it, as we'll see, is what's going on in John chapter 18. The whole court scene and them, doing this mock trial of Jesus as they're trying to have him convicted. We're going to see all that kind of stuff come out. But if you want to turn to John chapter 18, we're going to read just a little bit about it. I'm going to start in verse 19 as it talks about what's going on. It says in verse 19, the high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. And Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews always meet. And in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Do you answer the high priest like that? And Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? And then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. A little bit of history is what we're going to get in some of this first lesson. What's going on with this is Annas was the high priest before, but he had kind of grown older, and his son-in-law Caiaphas had become the high priest. But Annas was still the high priest. Caiaphas was just appointed to that, but all of the Sanhedrin and people really still regarded Annas as the high priest, and they were the one that he looked to. So that's why we start out with Annas, and then they sent it to Caiaphas. And again, in the middle of the night, we have this trial with Caiaphas that happens. Caiaphas being the head of the Sanhedrin and the technical, also the high priest at the time. But it's in the middle of the night, and it's this mock trial. They have witnesses that they're drumming up, and the purpose of this trial is not to determine whether or not Jesus Christ is guilty. It's to try and find a way to prove him guilty. It's the whole trial's purpose is just to show guilt. There's no desire to find out what the truth is. That's what's going on with Jesus Christ is going through this. So as he's going through this trial, we see all these things happening. But go ahead and turn down to verse 28. Look down at verse 28. And this is what it says. It says, Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might not eat the Passover. Then Pilate then went out to them and asked, What accusation do you bring against this man? And they answered and said to him, If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. Then Pilate said to them, You take him and judge him according to your law. Therefore the Jews said to him, It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus answered him, Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me? And Pilate answered, Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. Pilate therefore said to him, Are you a king then? Jesus answered, You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate said to him, What is truth? When he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no fault in him at all. But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Then they all cried again, Not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. So what we have with this, just starting out, is Pilate having this battle that he's going through. And again, I really wanted to kind of focus just on the historical part with Pilate. Pilate has been here trying to get Jerusalem under control. It became his job. And he's kind of put in an impossible position because of that. And he has this impossible decision to make. Yet he had the ability to make a decision that would have changed the whole world. Now we know when we look at it, this was part of God's plan and that Pilate wasn't going to change his decision on this. But he had the ability to. If he would just stand against the flow, if he would actually just follow what he actually believed and listen instead of listening to the crowds. But the problem with Pilate is he was in a really bad position. Caesar had tied Pilate's hands to quell the uprisings that were in Jerusalem already. He had repeatedly offended the Jews. The Jews didn't like Pilate. They didn't like him at all. For one thing, he was the Roman person that was there over them. But for another thing, he kept doing things to offend them and offend their religion. He had done all sorts of, he had brought in the Roman idols and tried to set them up in the middle of the night inside Jerusalem, and the Jews weren't happy about that. He had mingled the blood of the Gentiles with the blood from the sacrifices and defiled that. There's stories of Pilate, and he had gone in and set things up in his house with his idols, and the crowd had come to protest what he was doing. And during that, he had set his own people up in the crowd, his own guards. And when the crowds came together to protest, they pulled off their cloaks and just started killing everybody and beating them with clubs. That's who Pilate was. But because of this, every time something happened with Pilate, the Sanhedrin, the Jews, the Pharisees, they would send reports to Caesar, telling Caesar, hey, this guy's doing all this kind of stuff. And it would keep making these uprisings inside of Jerusalem. And to Caesar, Jerusalem wasn't a place that he really wanted to deal with. It wasn't a big target for him. He just wanted to have peace and be quiet and stay out of his way, kind of thing. So every time he got one of these bad reports, what it really did was go back on what Pilate was and who he was at the time. So Pilate was instructed by Caesar that it was his job to keep peace. You know, we talk about the times then that there was this turmoil that was going on, and we talk about it just being ready to erupt this Passover. And it was Pilate's job to keep the peace. So as Pilate does this, and he's confronted by the Jews with Jesus Christ, all he knows is no matter what, he has to keep the peace. So the decision that he's making, the decision that he's required to make, isn't just a moral decision. And in fact, as you read the text, you hear it coming back to it a few times with the Jews calling him on this. And he tells them, look, I find nothing wrong with this man. And the Jews tell him, look, you're the guy who's supposed to be doing this. We can't kill him. You have to do it. This is the Romans' job. And as we'll hear the crowds, and they're shouting at him to kill Jesus. He's saying, I can't find anything. I should be releasing this man. And they tell him, well, if you do this, it's going to get back to Caesar. Aren't you supposed to be following Caesar? And this man sees he's a king. If he's a king, then Caesar's not a king. And they tell him, we know no king but Caesar. The Jews actually, we don't know any king. The only king we know is Caesar. And putting this back on Pilate and reminding him basically that it's his job to keep the peace. And that if anything goes wrong because of the release of Jesus Christ or him being just let go or beaten, let go, or anything that doesn't satisfy the Sanhedrin's quest for blood, if it falls anything short of that it's going to come back on Pilate, and he's already on such a short rope. So we see Pilate having to make some of these decisions. Well, let me go back to what I said earlier. Pilate has a choice. It's not an easy choice, but he had the choice to say, this is an innocent man. I am not going to crucify him. He has that choice. It's on him. But instead of following his own moral code, instead of following his own knowledge of that Jesus Christ was innocent, instead of following that, he decides instead to give in to the crowds. And he follows what the Jews are recommending. So it's on him that he sends an innocent man, Jesus Christ, to be crucified.